Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. This evening's show is part of our Legislative Issues series hosted by Jim Parisi. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
Today we're going to talk about an important issue for all Rhode Islanders. We're going to talk about payday lending. And joining us, we have two different guests. Representative Frank Ferry, thanks for joining us.
Jim, thanks so much for the invitation.
Okay. Frank, you are a representative of the 22nd District in Warwick. You've been in the Assembly since 2007.
Yes.
And you serve on the House Finance Committee, the Small Business Committee, and I know you were very active on the issue of affordability for higher education, heading up a study commission on that.
Yes.
Okay. The other thing I want viewers to know is you're owner and operator of Town Hall Lanes, which is real important for me being a Johnston resident, because I spent many a Saturday afternoon with children's bowling parties at your establishment.
Good to hear that, Jim. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And finally, a grad of Rhode Island Public Schools,
Yes.
Classical High School, and then you went to Bryant, correct?
I went to Bryant.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah. And also joining us is Kate Brewster. Thank you for joining us today. You are the head of the Economic Progress Institute, and I got that name right on the first try, didn't I?
That's right.
And where you're executive director currently, and your background, having done some work in social services, you also are a graduate of University of Rhode Island and Rhode Island College, where you got a master's degree, right?
Can't get more Rhode Island than that. Right.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, thanks for giving us some time
Thrilled
today.
to be here.
Good. Before we talk about payday lending, I always like getting a little bit of background, and whenever I have a politician in the studio, my first question is always, why'd you run for office? How'd you get involved in politics?
Well, that's a great question. I actually got to run for political office through my advocacy for marriage equality. At the time, back in 2004, I had been going to the State House just as a citizen, not really affiliated with any group at the time. Some of us had gotten together and determined that because of the passage of the marriage Supreme Court in Massachusetts, that we should do something in Rhode Island. So that's about when we started marriage equality. But at the time, I started going to the State House and just talking to legislators and telling them who I was, my personal story. And that led to my more involvement in marriage equality. I became eventually the chair in 2007, and then my representative happened to resign. And the people I was working with said, Frank, this is a good opportunity for you to run. I wasn't even thinking of running for public office, truly. And I said, I can't run for public office, but it's a citizen legislature. And you know, you don't know what your experience is until you actually sit down and say, well, what qualities do I have to run? And like you said, I own a business, and for 25 years I've been running a bowling center. And I'm involved in my community. I'm involved in my neighborhood association. I've been was secretary of that for a long time. So, and I'm always somebody who wants to know how something works. And, you know, I ran for office, I had a lot of support, and lo and behold, here I am, 6 years later.
Sure. And that was your first office that you ran for. It's not like you ran for council before or anything else, correct?
No. So I felt like I was behind 8 ball on that, but it's been a great experience.
Yeah, that's terrific. And other than this issue of payday lending, which we're going to spend some time talking about, what are your other priorities in the General Assembly this year?
Well, you know, I've tried to immerse myself in several of the issues that are going on. Healthcare, I'm working with a coalition called Health Right that is concerned about healthcare in Rhode Island to make sure that we have comprehensive planning. And I've been on that coalition for about the whole time I've been in office. So we have a bill going in for that. Of course, you mentioned that I'm the chair of the House Commission on Studying Affordability and Accessibility of Education. Last year on finance, I was the chair of the subcommittee on education. And so I've taken a great interest in education and working on those issues and getting involved in that. And you know, being a small business person, of course, I'm concerned on the economy, and I'm on the small business committee. So there's a lot going on. We spend a lot of time. They call it a part-time job, but we know better.
And even before you started the job as being the legislator, you're a politician running for office. So what are the issues that you were talking about when you went door to door last fall, asking for people to vote for you?
Well, I would talk about education. I would talk about the skills gap that we have, about, you know, making sure that our students have the tools that they need from our administration, from the state, so they can graduate with the skills they need and go into their careers. Of course, jobs in the economy is high in everybody's mind. I know as a small business person that my business has revenues dropped because of people not coming as often as they could because they don't have the funds, the disposable funds that they need, or they're unemployed. I deal with that a lot. I have youth leagues, and I notice, I talk to the parents, and sometimes they're having problems just coming up with the few bucks that it takes. And, you know, and as a progressive, I think it is, I want to work with them. I want to make sure that their kids can still be able to bowl and that type of thing. So, you know, I had a lot of discussions. It was interesting because when I went up to somebody's door and told them that I was a business person, now it's going to be 29 years that I have the business. Wow. That generated a lot of discussion about the economy, about business, and what business needs. So, and the environment, a few years ago, I helped pass a bill to conserve water, for us at least to plan to conserve water in Rhode Island. We get a lot of rain, but a lot of snow this year, maybe, but we have some issues that we need to make sure that we plan for the future as far as are we going to have a water supply we need, clean, drinkable water. And I could go on, but
it sounds like a full plate already.
It is.
Kate, what is the Economic Progress Institute, and what do you do for them as executive director?
So first, I just want to say that Representative Ferry was my state rep before I moved to Wakefield, and he really was a tremendous community leader. Led our first Christmas Carol outage in a very long time in the Riverview section of Warwick. So. The Economic Progress Institute is a research and advocacy organization, and we develop and promote policies, state policies, that will improve the economic security of Rhode Islanders. So we look at policies that will help ensure that people have the skills they need to compete in today's economy, as Representative Ferry mentioned, that will make sure that families are able to meet their basic needs, and that the state has the resources that it needs in order to provide vital public services that all Rhode Islanders enjoy, and that help protect low and modest income families.
And where are you housed?
We are housed at the Rhode Island College School of Social Work. We were actually founded by a professor there back in 1999, Professor Nancy Gewirtz and Linda Katz, who still serves as our policy director. And it was an opportunity for students and faculty to get involved. We have since become independent, but the college has been gracious enough to host us there. But we are an independent organization. We pay rent to the college and enjoy having the students and faculty with us there.
Did you first get involved when you were a student?
I was. I graduated with my Master's of Social Work degree, and at the time, Nancy and Linda were forming the organization, and I had gone into social work thinking I would work with families in crisis, but Nancy quickly helped me understand how important policy is in the lives of people. Payday lending, for example, how big of an impact it really plays. And so from there, I decided that would be my focus.
That's terrific. Representative, what is payday lending. Even before we talk about what legislation is in, could you help us understand what payday lending is?
Sure, absolutely, because I know there's a lot of people who don't quite understand it. It's an industry where if you can get a quick loan. You go to a storefront, you have to have a checking account, and you can borrow for a 10% fee up to, I think right now, is it $400?
$450.
$450 in Rhode Island. The average loan is about $375. You pay 10% fee, and you have to pay it back. You have to write them a check to pay them back in 2 weeks, which is 2 weeks, and I think actually it's about 13 days, because you have to be on that 14th day, you have to be there. So you hold the money for about 13 days. And in that 2 weeks, if you pay it back, so on a $375 loan, you owe $37.50, and that would be it if you pay it off in that 2 weeks. Now, the average borrower turns that over 8 times, and the effective rate of interest in Rhode Island, because of the 10% fee, is 260%. So it sounds simple. It sounds like something that, hey, that doesn't sound so bad. You know, I need something for an emergency. I go to the storefront. You have to verify you have a job. They don't do a background check. They just, as long as you have a check, you write them that check, and in 2 weeks they'll cash that check for the $375 plus the $37.50 fee.
Do they verify employment when you go and try and secure a payday loan?
I think they ask, but I don't think they verify it. I do have an employee who got caught up in this trap, because even though it sounds like, oh yeah, in 2 weeks I can pay it off, but for the most part, the people who are making these loans are the people who have a problem right now making payments on everyday necessities, or on their gas bill, or on their electric bill, or just foods, or maybe some medicine. There are some myths about payday loans and who's taking them and what they're using them for. The Pew Institute have done 2 studies now, and the average person who takes out a payday loan, I think it's like 81%. I have some notes. I check it out. But I think it's 81% of the people who take out payday loans take them out for everyday expenses, not emergency expenses.
Sure. So Kate, I've been fortunate where I haven't had to try and secure a loan myself. What can you tell me about the lenders? Who are these organizations that are giving payday loans out?
Well, there are 2, I think, primary ones in Rhode Island, Advance America and Check and Go. Representative Ferry was discussing before the show about how actually Advance America now is owned by a company in Mexico. And I think there were 30-something storefronts in the state. And, as Representative Ferry said, these products are marketed as a short-term solution to a financial crisis. And what we know from this Pew study that was done with real borrowers is that it is mostly people who are not able to meet their monthly expenses. And we know Rhode Island's a high-cost state. Lots of people don't make enough to meet the cost of living here, and so they might go to a lender, take out a loan, and then in 2 weeks, when the lender takes that money out of their bank account because they've written them a check, whoops, they find now there's no money in their bank account. They have to go back to the lender and secure another loan. And that's where the fees really start piling up. You're paying $45, $50 on a $450 loan every 2 weeks. So this is truly problematic for people that we know are struggling.
Yeah. And what type of person then is really availing themselves of this? Is this the working poor? Is this people who have medical emergencies? What do you know about the typical payday loan recipient, if you will? Well,
the Pew study actually found that most of the folks, you're at higher risk of using a payday loan if you have less than a college education, if you're making less than $40,000 a year, if you're renting, African Americans are more likely to avail themselves of payday loans, and people who are separated or divorced, actually. So those are some risk factors, but I think what we know is that many people, might find themselves looking for an alternative to maybe asking a friend or using a credit card, and have this marketed to them and decide, well, I'll try it. And lo and behold, 8, 10 turnovers down the road, they're finding that they're actually going back to that friend to say, help me get out of this mess. And if you read the study, folks say, I wish I would have just done that in the first place, because I ended up spending a lot more. And actually, nationally, the average loan is about $375, and the interest paid on that loan is $520.
Wow.
That's what the study discovered from borrowers.
And that's a lot less money than the fees that my employee paid, because he actually went from November of one year to July and kept paying $30, $35 every 2 weeks. Okay, so it was almost like $1,000 he paid on that original. It was incredible.
That is a stunning number in terms of how much you have to pay just to secure a small loan for short-term benefit, whether it's an emergency or not, I imagine.
Right. And I want to make it known that legislation that we have in is not going to eliminate payday loans. We're not saying that, we don't want them anymore. But we just, in 2006, there was, 2005, I think it was, special legislation to remove payday lenders from small loan legislation or regulations, which meant that a top rate of 36% for small loans that we have didn't apply to them anymore. And that's when, I think back then, they actually had a 15% charge, which came out to be about, I think 390%, I think at the time. And in 2010, we lowered that to a 10% fee. So it lowered their interest rate to 260.
So these payday lenders haven't been around for decades. This is a fairly recent phenomenon in Rhode Island as far as this particular industry?
I think in 1998 or 99, there was legislation to create the payday lenders, or to give the payday lenders the right to come into Rhode Island.
And Jim, it's important to note, Rhode Island now is the only state in New England that allows the interest rates that a payday lender would come into your state to do. I mean, as Representative Ferry said, we're just trying to lower that to 36%, and by the industry's own admission, that's just too low for them to be able to survive and make a profit. So where we're always trying to compare ourselves to our New England neighbors, here's an instance where we should be saying we should not be the only state in New England that's allowing this practice.
So in all of the other New England states, there's still a cap on interest of 36% or something along those lines?
Some of them have different caps, but nobody has one higher than 36%.
Right. And the military Congress also banned the use of payday loans for the military, recognizing a few years ago that they were actually posing a real threat to the financial security of the families. They were becoming a weight on soldiers, and so now there's a 36% cap on
they had determined that it was a threat to our national security because payday lenders were setting up offices or storefronts around military bases.
Right.
And our own Senator Reid was part of that change because he even is quoted as saying that it was a security threat. So any active military person can, a payday loan storefront or company can only charge them up to 36%.
Okay, so you've described what payday loans are and what payday lending is all about. So now be a little more specific about what the legislation is that you've introduced and how long you've introduced it. But just describe what you're trying to accomplish in addressing the payday loan situation.
What we're trying to do is just make the product more reasonable to use. Like I said, we're not trying to eliminate it. We're not doing away with payday loans. We're just dropping the interest rate to where what we're doing is we're taking the special exemption that the 2005 legislation gave to payday loan lenders to be able to charge the higher rate. We're taking that away, just that special legislation clause, and putting them back into small loan lenders.
So
So they
also-
come under the same regulations.
Sure. So all we're really doing is just turning back the clock on that exemption that was created
Right.
8-10 years
Because
ago.
this is really causing undue hardship on people who really need this type of a loan. Now, there are some alternatives, and Kate, if you want to talk about some of the alternatives that are going,
Sure.
that we have.
Well, we know that in Rhode Island there's an organization called the Capital Good Fund, which is now providing small loans to folks. And they're actually finding that people who are coming to them are coming to get money so that they can pay off their payday loan and enjoy a much more reasonable product and interest rate through the Capital Good Fund. Navigant Credit Union, we know, is also offering some loan products that people can use that are much more reasonable, and that's available. And we know from the Pew study that people will, when they have regulated payday lenders in other states and effectively really caused the industry to go out of business in certain places, that there has been a net reduction in people seeking alternatives, and they actually have decided to cut back expenses, go to family or friends, use a credit card, and seek alternatives to this. But we definitely encourage people, if they are in trouble, to call the Capital Good Fund or Navigant Credit Union. It may be a day or two before they're approved for such a loan. I think that's part of the lure of the payday lender. You can walk in and get the money, but the ripple effects down the road are much more harmful.
And those loans would be available for any Rhode Islanders, those alternatives you just described?
Yeah, you need to qualify. And at the Capital Good Fund, I know if you don't qualify right away, they will provide you with financial counseling that at the end of that, assuming that you participate, you can likely be qualified for the loan.
Representative, you've been working on this legislation for
3 years.
3 years now? Yeah. So how would you characterize the opposition? What are the opponents of your legislation? I presume it's the payday lenders themselves. What are they saying to convince people not to support your bill?
Well, I just happen to have a letter here that came in the mail yesterday. So why don't I just take it right from there? Their handout here. It says payday advances cost $10 per 100 borrowed and do not compound interest. Payday advances are less expensive than other credit options, but the credit options, they don't talk about the good. Is it neighbor fund?
Capital Good Fund.
Capital Good Fund. They talk about internet payday advance, which is $25,
illegal in Rhode Island.
which is illegal, kind of. Overdraft protection. They talk about overdraft. They compare it to credit card late fees, late and reconnect fee on utility bills, and bounce check merchant fees. If consumers do not pay us back on time, there are no additional charges, which I don't understand that, because you have to pay it off in 2 weeks. If you don't pay it off in 2 weeks, you actually roll it over, and which means you're paying another 10% fee. So Advance America does not allow rollovers in Rhode Island. It says they permit one rollover. Well, that's interesting because my employee had rolled it over from November to July, so I don't understand that. And what happens too is people actually, what do they call it? They bounce from one payday lender. Oh, pinball, that's the term. Mm-hmm. They go from one payday lender to another payday lender. Talk about overdraft fees. Well, actually, to write a bad check is illegal in Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. So.
And the Pew report actually found that when the lenders go in and take the money that you've written a post-dated check for, that actually often causes you to experience an overdraft fee.
Right.
So one is causing the other to occur. Mm-hmm. So now more problems.
Right.
Jim, we have on the Rhode Island Payday.org is the website I have. We have 10 dirty...
That's ripayday.org, right?
ripayday.org.
For our viewers who are going to click on right now, I want to make sure they go to the right place.
ripayday.org.
There you go.
We have 10 dirty secrets of payday lending. I'd just like to go over those. It says payday lenders target people collecting Social Security. As a matter of fact, I brought to the attention of the Attorney General last year a report that specifically talked about what retirees are spending on with their Social Security payments, which they're not supposed to be, and payday lending was a big item on that report. as Kate had said earlier, Advanced America's profits go to Mexico. The company that Advanced America was in Ohio and they've been bought out by Grupo Electra in Mexico. So the profits are they're not even staying in the United States. They're actually going out of the country. Payday loan, pinball, like I talked about. Christmas and back to school are Payday's busiest times. Absence of payday lenders improves family finances. Payday laws protections are easily circumvented by payday lenders. Rhode Island law allows payday lenders to hold 3 borrower checks. Sometimes they'll write a check for the original loan amount plus they'll write a check for the fee, and so they just keep cashing the check for the fee instead of cashing the check for the original loan. So it's not actually a rollover. Payday lending creates high anxiety, high pressure, low paying jobs. Payday lenders use aggressive collection techniques, and payday lending is the crack cocaine of financial institutions. Their business model is for their customer to roll it over. They're encouraged. There's more information in there if you go on the website. But if customers don't roll over these loans, then Advanced America and Check and Go. And there's a new company that I've seen in Warwick now. I don't know if it's a national company or if it's just a local chain now. I forget the name of it. But without the rollover, they wouldn't stay in business.
Yeah.
And Jim, I'll just mention that they do have a very vested interest in keeping these high interest rates here. Last year, we know that there's a great coalition that's been formed, many community groups. The City of Providence, the City of Central Falls are members, the AARP, United Way, AFL, many of the labor groups. And we know that Advance America and the lenders outspent the advocacy efforts 10-to-1 in the state of Rhode Island on lobbyists, on radio advertisements, on mailings. So that's clearly part of the reason that that this has been allowed to be maintained for so long.
Because I know if I take a look at the number of elected officials who've signed on to the legislation in both the House and the Senate, there's considerable support on the floor, isn't there?
There is. In the House, on my bill, there's 52 signatures on the bill.
52 out of 75.
52 out of 75.
Who have a calculator.
And in the Senate, I believe Senator Juan Pichardo is the sponsor of the Senate bill, and he's gotten 20-something, almost like maybe 29, around.
Out of 38.
Well over 20, yeah, out of 38. So there is a lot of support. You know, the industry is putting a lot of money into lobbying. I mean, we know that the former Speaker of the House is being paid, just him alone is being paid like $50,000, and there's other lobbyists, and there's other money coming in because it's big business for these companies. For this, there's a lot of money involved.
Sure. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Could you just briefly describe what kind of coalition efforts we're going to see here in the next couple of months to get this bill through?
I think we'll be having events to raise awareness about this, talking to legislators, being on television programs, just trying to get the word out to Rhode Islanders that they should really encourage their state rep and senator to support and push for passage of this, the lower interest rate.
Right, we're having a rally at the State House. I'm not sure when this is airing, but I know on March 27th there'll be a rally at the State House. And we have a strong religious coalition behind us.
Thank you. Yep.
Right, that, you know, because this is an issue, like Kate said earlier, that lower income people are being hit especially hard on this, and it's, you know, it's just another attack.
And this is really, Jim, a great no-cost way that the legislature can help families who have been struggling in our state. We've got twice as many people working part-time, stagnant wages, increased poverty, clearly leading more folks to be in need. But this is a way that we can protect people, especially as the recession, you know, begins to ease. And this is really important for people who have been hit hard by that.
Just this past weekend, I had a call from a constituent who's out of work, looking for a job, having trouble paying for his heat, having trouble paying his bills, asking me if I could give him a reference on a job that he applied for. I didn't really know him, and then during the conversation, he happened to mention that he went to a payday loan lender. And I was like, do you know how much you're going to be paying them? He said he was at his wit's end. He's just like, he doesn't want them to shut off his electricity or whatever. And I said, no, they can't right now anyway. So, so I'm working with him.
Yeah, well, hopefully, you know, this discussion about not only the issue in the legislation, but the alternatives that exist out there will certainly help Rhode Islanders, you know, wend their way through, you know, a fiscal crisis if they have one. Both of you, I thank you for your time. You know, this has been a terrific show in informing people about a really important legislative issue, and I hope to have you on the show again in the fall when you can talk about the great success you had on this legislation this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of American Labor History. My name's Scott Molloy. I'm a professor at the University of Rhode Island at the Schmidt Labor Research Center. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this series, which has seemed to have gone on interminably, that we offer a master's degree program in labor and industrial relations as well as personnel at the university. So if you're in the labor movement or in public administration or even in business, you might want to stop in and check us out, or perhaps a certificate program which only requires 4 courses altogether. Anyway, last time we took a look at one of the worst periods in not only American history but world history, and of course that was the advent and the playing out of World War II between 1941 and 45 for our purposes, but much longer in other places in the world. And we came up with some very unusual statistics that I don't think a lot of people knew then or even know now, and that was a lot of American GIs perished in that awful conflagration in the foxholes of Europe, in the naval battles of the Pacific, and it eventually added up to 300,000 American military officers and people perished in that conflict. But at the same time, often forgotten, was that 100,000 Americans died at home in industrial accidents. They were part of the arsenal of democracy, creating the materiel required for the war effort was as important as those fighting it. But no death, of course, is any less than any other, and it was a brutal time. But I suggested last time as well that the demographers, the people who look at population statistics, discovered something rather highly unusual, that during the war, when we lost 400,000 people above and beyond the ordinary death rate, that the longevity, the life expectancy of the average American actually increased, and increased rather dramatically in the worst of times. And they couldn't figure out for many years as to what had actually created this. And finally they came up with the idea that because wages were capped and people could not go from one company to another corporation or a business, that they were able to provide what we'd only describe today as rudimentary medical benefits. It might have been a checkup on the shop floor once a year to see if you had any problems. It might have been a very minimal prescription plan. But what happened was they discovered problems, medical problems that might lead to your death a number of years later. They caught them early, they took care of them, and the labor movement, which had dreamed that the working class would have these types of perks someday, finally saw it come true in the worst of times. That's why war is one of those things you can never know what comes out of it. Anyway, once the war was over, a couple of other interesting things happened in America and the labor movement itself. As you may remember, the wages were stagnant during World War II. They were capped, and yet profits, on the other hand, had no restraints on them whatsoever. which meant the corporations were making out very well, while the workers themselves were pretty much stuck in a static earning phase. But as soon as the war was over, the country went on a strike wave that lasted from 1945 at the end of the war all the way into 1947. And millions of people went on a strike, and in a war-weary nation that had gone through the Great Depression, World War II, and then to come home and face strike after strike after strike, tested everyone's patience. And so I think a lot of people began to turn against the turmoil anyway, and maybe some of them turned against the labor movement as well. So you have this widespread breakout of labor turmoil. And at the same time, beginning in 1946, we have the advent of something in American history really unprecedented in its numbers, and that, of course, was the baby boomers. The GIs came home, their wives and their girlfriends, soon to be their wives, had an unprecedented number of young kids. The hospitals were so filled in that era right after the war that women were going into labor in the corridors, sometimes giving birth not in a hospital room but anywhere they could put them. And the baby boomers, which reached something like 75 million children between 1946 and 1964, really changed the face of America. And I'll come back to that at the end of either this program or the next one, because it would have a tremendous impact, again, not only on America, but the labor movement itself. But in 1947, as those strikes began to peter out and a certain degree of normalcy returned to the workplace, the Republican Party in particular was doing its due diligence in writing legislation which would be known as the Taft-Hartley Act, named after a couple of Republican politicians in Congress. And it really was a counterweight to the old National Labor Relations Act in the mid-30s, which had given labor the right to organize, unprecedented in American history, along with a whole host of other rights that they had never seen before, but had only dreamed about. And so in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act took away a lot of those rights, added new burdens to the labor movement. For example, it ended the closed shop, in which, in order to get a job, in some places you had to already be a union member, which of course was a great boon to organize labor. Today we have a union shop where you have to join after some 30 days usually, or in Rhode Island it's an agency shop. You don't have to join the union, but you have to pay the same amount in dues as the other people that you're working with, because you're getting the same benefits that the union negotiated for you. We also saw the end to no secondary boycotts, which meant if you were an auto worker in Detroit and you were putting in, let's say, carpeting from J.P. Stevens, and there was a strike there, then you could refuse to handle that hot cargo, they'd call it. But this law did away with that, and that was a tremendous arrow in labor's arsenal to try and get on an equal par with the corporations. It called for a 90-day cooling off period in case national security was in effect. And more importantly, and something you're seeing in the news today, which we haven't seen in decades, is that Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act called for what they call a right to work states. Of course, in the labor movement, we call it right to work for less. And what it means, and it's a very un-American thing, let's say a majority of people in a workforce decide they want a union. Well, if it's a right to work state, and about half the states in the union have that now, and we've seen a couple of Union stalwarts like Michigan and a couple of other states in the old Rust Belt go that direction, very unusual. In the right-to-work states, even though a majority chose the Union, it allowed those who didn't vote for the Union or don't want to be part of the Union, even though it was a majority vote, they don't have to pay the dues or anything else that goes along with it. But they're still entitled to receive the same benefits, and the Union, in case of a costly or complex grievance or even a dismissal, still has to represent that other worker who refuses to join the Union and pay dues. And some people say, well, this is a great American way to do things. I don't think it is. It's undemocratic, it's unfair, and it's unfortunate. And we're going to be watching that very closely as time goes on here. And soon after World War II ended, those of you who've got a long memory out there, something else happened which would change the face of the labor movement forever, and in some ways change America as well. The hot war of World War II, in which so many people perished here in America and even millions more across the globe, there was a new Cold War. The old allies that had made up the World War II winning coalition, particularly the Soviet Union, now broke with its former allies, Britain, France, and the United States. We saw in 1949 the Red Chinese moving into Beijing, taking over, and American business people would often lament the fact that they lost such an incredibly large opportunity to sell whatever it was that the Chinese needed, not that they could afford very much at that time. But the real problem was that in the labor movement, and this goes back to the 19th century, there had always been socialists, and in the 20th century there had been some communists. These were people, for the most part, with very few exceptions, were there to try and create a better world, trying to lift up the working class into the lower middle class, what the unions eventually did accomplish anyway. But there was such a fuss, because with that fallout between the Soviet Union or Russia and the old allies, there was a fear that anyone who might be in any way sympathetic to the Soviet Union or to the Chinese, or try to take a more even-handed approach, were somehow therefore in favor, or even worse, might be spies. And of course, there were spies on every continent and every country. Did the labor movement have a few? There was a handful, but probably no more or less than in any other group or organization operating in our country at that time. And in order to counteract left-wing activity overseas, because in France, many of the leaders of the underground against the Nazi war machine had been on the left. And so the United States, through George Marshall, instituted what's known as the Marshall Plan, a way to rebuild Europe, and incidentally and secondarily, to get a lot more Americans back to work. But because of all of this concern and this legitimate fear in some ways about the left operating in America, whether it was in the State Department, although we never saw really very many people there at all, or in the labor movement, there was a backlash, particularly after the Great Depression, World War II, the strike wave of the mid-40s. And labor took it on the chin. And many people will refer to this era as kind of a 20th century witch hunt, led by none other than Joe McCarthy, bomber pilot and fighter in World War II, the junior senator from Wisconsin, who used to go around giving talks for almost a decade, saying that he had in this list of papers, you could put a different number every time he spoke, 100 leftists in the Defense Department, or 150. He changed it every time he spoke, and no one ever really got an opportunity to see that list. He just threw it around, and the country seemed to gobble it up and feel that we were under siege in a whole new way, despite the fact that we had just won World War II. So as we look at that era going down to about 1949, just as we're about to get into the 1950s and a whole new way of life, for good or for bad, in 1949, the Congress of Industrial Organization, the CIO, born out of turmoil in the 1930s, attempting to organize everybody and anybody, regardless of skill or color or gender or immigrant status, they brought them all together. But in 1949, under tremendous pressure from Congress, they expelled 11 unions the same way they had been expelled from the American Federation of Labor not much more than a decade earlier. And does that mean that whole union was left-wing? No, not at all. It means some of the prominent leaders, maybe some of the shop stewards and activists. And again, these people might have been pushing for a better contract, for more say in how the company ran. They might have been advocating that working people run for office, whether it be city council or the state legislature. But again, the temper of the times would dictate almost everything. The 1930s, everything was going the other way. Now the backlash, the pendulum and the clock go to the other side, and everyone's fearful of the Reds and the Bolsheviks, whether they were really just boogeyman and ghosts there or actual people. And of course, there were some actual people there. So the CIO would expel 11 unions, and of course, when you do something like that, it only gives credence to the enemy that their charges were true in the first place. Why would you be dismissing 11 national or international unions if there weren't Reds in them? And so once they did that, the labor movement began to run in many ways. And we'll see a lot of propaganda come out attacking the labor movement. This one says, join the CIO and help get a Soviet America. And of course, here's a picture of John L. Lewis, the coal miner and the head of the CIO for many years. And on the other side, another pamphlet, Communism's Iron Grip on the CIO, with another picture of John L. Lewis holding up a CIO sign. These were put out by the millions and often influenced people who perhaps didn't know any better. And we see even some of the stalwarts, some of the great union chiefs who had gone through heaven and hell in attempting to bring the working class up to a better way of life, suddenly giving in to this fear. And it was a witch hunt in many years, not only with Joe McCarthy, but people like Richard Nixon, whom we discovered all about him many years later. Walter Reuther, who led the United Automobile Workers in 1937, said, so now the bosses are trying a new stunt. Remember the 1930s, the red decade. So now the bosses are trying a new stunt. They are whispering around that so-and-so, usually a militant trade union leader, is a Red. They think they will turn other workers against him. What the bosses really mean, however, Reuther said, is not that a leader is Red. They mean they don't like him because he's a loyal, dependable union man, a fighter who helps his brothers and sisters and is not afraid of the boss. And Not a lot of people today who aren't afraid of the boss. With jobs being scarce, you don't want to say the wrong thing. But in 1949, 12 years after Walter Reuther had uttered that famous quote, he gives one that's very different and really shows you the dichotomy between the 1930s and the late 1940s. Walter Reuther would say, "We can no longer tolerate within the family of the CIO the Communist Party masquerading as a labor union." And of course, this sent shockwaves throughout the labor movement, along with the expulsion of those 11 unions. Now, adding to all of this were some incidents on the international scene, which looked like perhaps old Red Russia was getting its fingers in a lot of countries, which it was. And certainly there were very few people in the labor movement or in the United States that would applaud that at all. The Cold War began to heat up. I mentioned that China fell, as we like to say, to the Red Chinese. We had a Korean War, and as we notice in the news today, that's heating up once again. We had a couple of Americans who went to the electric chair for allegedly passing on atomic secrets to Russia, which now had the atomic bomb and would have a nuclear one as well just a few years later in the early 1950s. So all of this would crush down on the labor movement because we'd always been picking people's pockets. We were the Robin Hood of the American people, trying to redistribute the wealth from the rich to the poor. And so we were always suspect for any types of witch scares that might come along. And so all sorts of rules and regulations and bills and legislations was passed in order to curtail, in order to emasculate, if you will, the labor movement. And so we see that by the early 1950s, not only did the CIO expel some radical unions, but the very people who had demanded that the CIO split up, usually people in Congress, once they had thrown the leftists out, they then went back and said, you know, you did a great job, a fantastic ability to toss these folks out, but you know, you still got some socialists in there, and you know, they're only one sneeze away from being to the far left. You got to get rid of them too. And so the labor movement would go back and maybe at the local level expel this one or that one for signing a petition or for asking for an increase in workers' compensation. But even that wasn't enough, because once the left was out, once the socialists were out, the politicians came back and said, you know, you've still got some liberals in there, and you know, they're the worst of all of them. They cause trouble, they look like they're good Americans, but they've got to go. And by this time, the labor movement had sort of learned its lesson and said, if we keep doing this, there won't be anyone left. And they finally put an end to it, but they lost a generation of fighters, people who had built the labor movement up in the 30s and 1940s. Meanwhile, our old buddy Joe McCarthy, who had started this Red Scare and brought it to its fruition, which we'll see in just a minute, had helped form a group called the House Un-American Activities Committee. This went after civil rights leaders, people who might speak out in favor of the environment, or who advocated for more worker say on the job. Now, McCarthy, by the early 50s, had kind of burnt himself out. He had, it's kind of like the person who yells wolf too many times. Eventually, nobody pays them any attention. And so McCarthy finally ended his own career by going to the far ends of the earth himself. He said that the State Department of America was infested, that's his word, infested with agents from Russia. He said he had a list of, as I mentioned earlier, a couple of hundred people, and then it varied all over the ballpark. Eventually, he would attack George Marshall, a former military figure who helped rebuild Europe so that it could stay democratic. He went after Dean Acheson, another political leader in America. And then finally, around 1953-54, he said that Dwight Eisenhower, the former commander of American forces in World War II, the President of the United States, was soft on communism. He didn't call him a communist, but he said he was soft on it. So you can see where a person like Joe McCarthy was going to go with all of this, and eventually nobody was exempt from his poison pen or his poison accusations to so many people. And a lot of folks, for example, scholars who simply said that China was going to fall to the left, lost their jobs because they had spoken out. Not because they were in favor of it, but because they had testified or written a book that predicted what would happen. Now, once the war was over, and once a lot of these problems had been taken care of, once the labor movement had been cleansed, so to speak, we discover that some of the things that were put into place that would change America forever, and only now do we see it unraveling, is that some elements that were given to returning GIs, endorsed by the labor movement as well, like the GI Bill. It meant that people could now get higher education even if they were from the working class. And I always like to tell my students at URI that for the first time ever in the early 50s, because of the GI Bill, there were now more students there, a lot of them former soldiers, than there were cows, because it had been an agricultural college. Now we had a lot of people. And the GI Bill also allowed returning vets to purchase a home on the installment plan, to get a mortgage. And of course, we've seen the problems that have come with that just recently, and we'll explore that a little bit differently in our next session as well. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week: Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.